The day I lost everything to Hurricane Miranda was the day I gained the power to destroy the woman who tried to break me. Margaret Thornfield thought a simple HOA violation notice would drive me from Willowbrook Estates forever. She had no idea that by the time the floodwaters receded, I'd own her pristine backyard, her reputation, and her entire carefully constructed world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a grieving widower with a fishing pole became the nightmare of the most powerful HOA president in Florida history. If you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen who made your life miserable, drop a comment below about what you would have done in my situation. Trust me, this story gets wild, and I want to hear if you think I went too far or not far enough. My name is David Chun, and before Hurricane Miranda changed everything, I was just another broken man trying to piece his life back together one cast at a time. 3 months earlier, I'd buried my wife, Sarah, after a 2-year battle with cancer that had drained our savings and left me rattled in ways I'm still trying to understand. We'd moved to Willowbrook Estates 2 years before her diagnosis, a planned community in Central Florida with perfectly manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and enough HOA rules to choke a lawyer. Sarah had loved it here. She'd spent hours in our backyard garden, carefully tending to her roses and talking about the grandchildren we'd never have. The community pond became our evening ritual. We'd sit on our dock with cheap wine and expensive dreams, watching the sunset paint the water gold. After she passed, that dock became my sanctuary. I'd fish there every morning before work and every evening after, not because I needed the food, but because it was the only place I could still feel her presence. I work as a senior hydrologist for the county, 23 years of studying water patterns, flood zones, and storm drainage systems. It's not glamorous work, but it pays well and gives me access to information most people never see. Information that would prove invaluable when Margaret Thornfield decided to declare war on a man who had nothing left to lose. Margaret had been HOA president for 7 years when I moved in, and she ruled Willowbrook Estates like her personal kingdom. Picture a woman in her mid-50s who'd never worked a day in her life, thanks to her husband's pharmaceutical fortune, but had channeled all that unused ambition into controlling every blade of grass in our neighborhood. She had steel gray hair always pulled back in a perfect bun, designer clothes that somehow made her look both expensive and cold, and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Her house sat on the highest point in the community, a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion with a pool that could host Olympic trials and a yard so pristine it looked computer-generated. She had no children, no hobbies beyond HOA enforcement, and apparently no human warmth whatsoever. The perfect storm of privilege, boredom, and unchecked power. For the first year after Sarah's death, Margaret and I coexisted peacefully. I kept my lawn mowed, my house painted the approved shade of beige, and my grief mostly private. But as my morning and evening fishing sessions became more frequent and more essential to my sanity, I started catching her attention in ways I'd later regret. The first incident happened on a Tuesday morning in late August. I was on my dock at sunrise, casting into the still water and trying to find some peace before another day of pretending to be functional, when I heard the click of expensive heels on the wooden planks behind me. "Excuse me, Mr. Chun." Margaret's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. I turned to see her standing at the edge of my dock, clipboard in hand, looking like she'd rather be handling radioactive waste than talking to me. "I need to discuss your fishing activities." I reeled in my lines slowly, buying time to process what was happening. "Good morning, Margaret. What about my fishing?" According to HOA regulations, Section 12.7, recreational watercraft and fishing equipment may only be used during designated community hours, which are 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. on weekdays and 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. on weekends. She read this like she was reciting scripture, never looking up from her clipboard. I stared at her for a long moment, wondering if she was serious. "Margaret, I'm fishing for my own dock, on my own property, in a community pond that we all pay maintenance fees for. The pond is community property, Mr. Chun, which means it falls under community regulations." Her smile was arctic. "I'm sure you understand." I didn't understand, and I told her so, but she'd already turned and walked away, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm of satisfied authority. I should have known then that this was just the opening move in a much larger game. The violation notice arrived 3 days later. A formal letter on HOA letterhead informing me that I'd been observed fishing during non-designated hours and that any future violations would result in fines starting at $200. $200 for casting a line into water that I helped pay to maintain from a dock that was technically on my property. I tried to be reasonable. I really did. I called Margaret and explained that fishing at dawn and dusk wasn't some rebellious act. It was when the fish were actually biting, and more importantly, it was when I could process my grief without judgment from neighbors or the need to appear strong for anyone else. I told her about Sarah, about how the dock was our special place, about how those quiet hours were keeping me from falling apart completely. Her response was a masterclass in bureaucratic cruelty. "Mr. Chun, I sympathize with your loss, but personal circumstances don't override community regulations. The rules exist for everyone's benefit, and exceptions create precedents we simply cannot allow." That should have been my first clue that reasoning with Margaret Thornfield was like negotiating with a hurricane, pointless and potentially destructive. For 2 weeks, I tried to comply with her ridiculous schedule. I'd fish during approved hours, surrounded by kids splashing in the shallow end and neighbors having loud conversations about property values and weekend plans. The magic of those quiet moments was gone, replaced by the feeling that I was performing grief instead of processing it. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in mid-September. Hurricane Miranda was still 3 days out, but as a hydrologist, I could already see the signs of what was coming. The barometric pressure was dropping, the wind patterns were shifting, and most importantly, the fish were behaving strangely, clustering in deeper water and feeding aggressively, as if they sensed the disruption ahead. I knew this might be my last chance to fish for several days, maybe weeks, depending on how bad the storm got. So I made the decision that would change everything. I went to my dock at 5:30 a.m., a full 4.5 hours before the approved fishing time. The water was glass smooth, reflecting the pre-dawn sky like a mirror. I'd been casting for maybe 20 minutes when I hooked into something significant, a largemouth bass that felt like it was attached to a truck bumper. I was fighting the fish, completely absorbed in the moment for the first time in weeks, when I heard those familiar heels clicking down the dock behind me. "Mr. Chun," Margaret's voice was ice-cold with satisfaction. "I specifically warned you about fishing during unauthorized hours." I didn't turn around, focused on landing the fish that was putting up the fight of its life. "Margaret, there's a hurricane coming. After Miranda passes through, nobody's going to be fishing for weeks. That's not my concern. My concern is residents who think they're above community standards." I finally landed the bass, a beautiful 6-pounder that would have made Sarah smile, and turned to face Margaret. She was dressed like she was heading to a board meeting, even at dawn on a Saturday, with her clipboard and her cold smile and her absolute certainty that she held all the power in this situation. "Look," I said, trying one last time to appeal to whatever human decency might be buried under all that suburban authority. "I understand you have a job to do, but—" "No buts, Mr. Chun. You've been warned, you've been fined, and you've chosen to continue violating clearly established regulations. This is your final warning. The next time I catch you fishing outside approved hours, I'll begin proceedings to have you removed from the community entirely." She said this like she was discussing the weather, completely matter-of-fact about destroying a man's life over the crime of catching fish at the wrong time of day. Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing on my dock with a beautiful bass in my hands and murder in my heart. That was the moment everything changed. Not when she threatened me, not when she fined me, but when I realized that Margaret Thornfield saw my grief, my connection to this place where my wife and I had been happy, as nothing more than an inconvenience to her perfectly ordered world. I released the bass back into the water and made a decision that would have terrified the old David Chun, the one who followed rules and trusted that reasonableness would prevail. The new David Chun, the one forged in loss and tempered by bureaucratic cruelty, decided that Margaret Thornfield had picked the wrong fight with the wrong man at exactly the wrong time. See, Margaret had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that because I was grieving, I was weak. She'd assumed that because I'd been compliant so far, I'd continue to roll over for whatever abuse she decided to dish out. Most importantly, she'd assumed that a simple county hydrologist couldn't possibly pose a threat to someone with her wealth, connections, and absolute control over the HOA board. She had no idea that my 23 years of studying water systems had given me access to information that could reshape the entire community. She had no idea that my grief had burned away every instinct towards self-preservation and social nicety, leaving behind something much more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and all the time in the world to plan his revenge. Hurricane Miranda was still 3 days out, but I could already see the pieces falling into place. Margaret's perfect house on the highest ground, the community's aging storm drainage system, the flood zone maps that only people like me knew how to read, the construction permits that had been approved despite obvious drainage issues, the environmental impact studies that had been filed but apparently never read by anyone on the HOA board. I spent those 3 days before the hurricane researching everything I could about Willowbrook Estates, its construction history, its drainage systems, its legal vulnerabilities, and most importantly, the specific ways that Margaret Thornfield had bent or broken rules when it suited her purposes. What I found was better than I could have hoped for. Willowbrook Estates had been built in 1998 on what used to be a natural wetland. The developers had done the minimum required environmental mitigation, creating the community pond and installing a basic storm drainage system, but they'd cut corners in ways that would prove catastrophic under the right conditions. Specifically, they'd installed undersized drainage pipes and positioned them in a way that would create a bottleneck effect during heavy flooding. Even more interesting was the fact that several houses, including Margaret's, had been built with illegal modifications to their drainage systems. Margaret's mansion had been constructed with an additional wing in 2018, a wing that required rerouting the community's main storm drain to accommodate its foundation. The permit for this work had been approved by the HOA board, which Margaret chaired, despite the fact that the HOA had no legal authority to approve modifications to community infrastructure. But the most beautiful discovery was hidden in the environmental impact documents from the original construction. The natural drainage pattern for our area flowed from Margaret's high ground down through the lower elevations where most of the community was built, and then into what was now the community pond. During normal conditions, this worked fine, but during extreme flooding, the kind that happened maybe once every 50 years, the natural flow would reverse, turning the pond into a collection point that would back up and flood the lower areas first, then continue rising until it reached the higher ground. Margaret's house, sitting proudly on the highest point in Willowbrook Estates, would be the last to flood. But it would flood eventually, and when it did, the water would have nowhere to go because of the illegal drainage modifications she'd approved for her own benefit. Hurricane Miranda was downgraded to a tropical storm by the time it reached us, but it still brought 15 inches of rain in 18 hours, more than enough to test every theory I developed about our community's drainage vulnerabilities. I spent the storm in my living room, watching the rain hammer my windows and monitoring the rising water levels in the community pond through my binoculars. Margaret had sent out a community-wide email the day before, reminding everyone that storm cleanup would need to comply with HOA standards and that any damage to common areas would be assessed to all residents equally. Even in the face of a natural disaster, she couldn't resist asserting her authority over people who were just trying to weather the storm safely. The pond began overflowing around hour 12 of the rainfall. I watched the water spill over the carefully manicured banks and start spreading across the community's lower-lying streets and yards. Within 2 hours, the storm drains were completely overwhelmed, exactly as I predicted, and the water began backing up into the drainage system. By hour 16, the flooding had reached the first tier of houses, mostly the smaller homes where young families and retirees lived. By hour 18, when the rain finally stopped, the water was 3 feet deep in some areas and still rising as the overloaded drainage system continued to back up. Margaret's house, of course, remained high and dry on its perfect hilltop perch. The next morning, I waded through ankle-deep water to assess the damage throughout the community. It was worse than I'd expected. Dozens of homes had significant flooding, ruined furniture, destroyed cars, and thousands of dollars in damage. The community pool had been contaminated with runoff. The playground was buried under debris, and the beautiful landscaping that Margaret was so proud of looked like a war zone. I spent the day helping neighbors pump out their basements and salvage what they could from the flooding, all while keeping detailed notes about water levels, damage patterns, and most importantly, the specific drainage failures that had turned a manageable storm into a community-wide disaster. Margaret, meanwhile, sent out another email expressing her sympathies for the flood victims and reminding everyone that insurance claims needed to be filed properly to avoid affecting the community's liability coverage. No offer to help, no acknowledgement that the flooding might have been preventable, just more bureaucratic management of other people's suffering. That was when I knew exactly how to destroy her. I spent the next week gathering documentation. Photos of the illegal drainage modifications around Margaret's house. Copies of the original environmental impact studies that showed the natural flooding patterns. Historical flood data that proved this level of rainfall should have been manageable with proper drainage. Most importantly, I obtained copies of all the HOA board meeting minutes from 2018, when Margaret had rammed through approval for her home addition despite multiple residents raising concerns about drainage impacts. The picture that emerged was clear. Margaret Thornfield had used her position as HOA president to approve modifications that benefited her property at the expense of community safety. When Hurricane Miranda tested those modifications, dozens of her neighbors had paid the price while she remained comfortable and dry. But I wasn't ready to spur my trap yet. Margaret had humiliated me publicly, threatened my home, and dismissed my grief as inconvenience. A simple expose of her corruption would be satisfying, but it wouldn't give her the kind of personal, devastating loss that she tried to inflict on me. For that, I needed to be more creative. The opportunity came 2 weeks after the hurricane, when Margaret announced that the HOA would be implementing new regulations for storm recovery. Any resident whose property had sustained damage would need to submit detailed repair plans for approval by the Architectural Review Committee, which she chaired. Any modifications that didn't meet community standards would be rejected, even if they were necessary for flood prevention. The message was clear. Even after a disaster that had damaged dozens of homes, Margaret was still more concerned with maintaining her perfect aesthetic vision than with helping residents protect themselves from future flooding. That's when I decided to buy her backyard. It took me 3 days of research to figure out how to make it work, but the solution was elegant in its simplicity. Margaret's illegal drainage modifications hadn't just redirected water flow. They'd also created an easement situation that she'd never bothered to properly document. When she'd rerouted the community's main storm drain to accommodate her home addition, she'd technically created a private drainage system that served both her property and several others. Under Florida law, when private drainage systems serve multiple properties, the property owners served by that system have the right to purchase easements to ensure continued access and maintenance. More importantly, if the property owner who controls the drainage system, in this case Margaret, had created that system through unpermitted modifications, any affected property owner could petition the county to establish a mandatory easement through eminent domain proceedings. I filed the petition on a Wednesday morning, requesting that the county establish a drainage easement across Margaret's backyard to restore the natural water flow that her illegal modifications had disrupted. The petition included all my documentation of the flooding patterns, the unpermitted modifications, and the connection between Margaret's drainage changes and the community-wide flood damage. The county engineer who reviewed my petition was a colleague I'd worked with for 15 years. When he saw the documentation I'd assembled, his first words were, "Jesus, David, how did nobody catch this during the original construction?" The eminent domain process in Florida is designed to move quickly when public safety is involved. Within 30 days, the county had scheduled a hearing to determine whether Margaret's backyard should be subject to a mandatory drainage easement. If approved, the county would have the right to excavate her entire yard to install proper drainage infrastructure, and Margaret would be required to pay for the restoration of the natural water flow patterns. The cherry on top? Because her original modifications had been done without proper permits, She would also face fines for environmental violations and be personally liable for any future flood damage that could be traced to her illegal drainage changes. I didn't tell Margaret about the petition immediately. Instead, I waited until the county sent her the official notification, then watched from my deck as she read the document in her perfectly manicured front yard. Even from a distance, I could see the exact moment when she realized what was happening. Her face went from confused to furious to pale in about 30 seconds. She looked up from the document and stared directly at my house, and I swear I could feel her rage from 300 yards away. She called me that evening, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "You think you're very clever, don't you, Mr. Chun? I think I'm protecting my community from future flooding disasters," I replied calmly. "Just like you've always claimed to be doing. This is harassment, and I won't stand for it. I'll fight this petition with everything I have." "That's your right, Margaret. I'm sure your lawyers will explain how difficult it is to fight eminent domain proceedings when they're based on documented public safety violations." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds before she hung up. The county hearing was scheduled for the following month, which gave Margaret plenty of time to hire lawyers and prepare her defense. It also gave me plenty of time to prepare for the second phase of my revenge. See, destroying Margaret's backyard was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. She tried to drive me from my home, the place where I'd been happy with Sarah, over something as trivial as fishing at the wrong time of day. She dismissed my grief and treated my pain like an inconvenience to her perfect world. For that level of cruelty, I needed to take away something much more precious to her than landscaping. I needed to take away her power. The HOA election was scheduled for December, just 2 months after the drainage hearing. Margaret had run unopposed for the past 3 election cycles, mostly because nobody wanted the hassle of dealing with community politics. But the post-hurricane chaos had people asking questions about leadership and accountability in ways they never had before. I started attending HOA board meetings, something I'd never done before Sarah's death. At first, I just listened and took notes, but gradually I began asking pointed questions about community maintenance, emergency preparedness, and the decision-making process for infrastructure modifications. Margaret clearly recognized what I was doing, but she couldn't stop me without looking petty and defensive. Every question I asked was reasonable on its face, even though we both knew I was systematically exposing the arbitrary and self-serving nature of her leadership. The turning point came during the October board meeting, when I raised the issue of emergency drainage improvements in light of the hurricane damage. I presented a detailed proposal for upgrading the community's stormwater management system, complete with cost estimates and engineering specifications. Margaret dismissed the proposal immediately, saying that the current drainage system was adequate and that expensive modifications weren't necessary. She said this while sitting in a room full of residents who'd lost thousands of dollars worth of belongings to flooding that proper drainage could have prevented. The reaction was swift and brutal. 3 different residents stood up to challenge her dismissal, pointing out that their flood insurance claims were still being processed and that another storm could ruin them financially. A 4th resident asked why Margaret's house had been the only one in the community to escape flooding entirely. That's when Margaret made the mistake that sealed her fate. "My house didn't flood because it's properly situated and maintained," she said, with that condescending smile that had infuriated me for months. Perhaps if other residents took better care of their properties, they wouldn't be so vulnerable to weather events. The room erupted. Residents started shouting over each other, demanding to know how property maintenance could prevent storm flooding, asking why the HOA president was blaming victims instead of addressing systemic drainage problems. Margaret tried to restore order, but she'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That's when I stood up and delivered the knockout punch. "Actually, Margaret, your house didn't flood because you illegally modified the community drainage system to redirect water away from your property," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos. "The county is currently reviewing an eminent domain petition to restore the natural drainage patterns that your unpermitted modifications disrupted." I never seen a room go silent so quickly. You could literally hear people breathing as the implications sank in. Margaret tried to recover, claiming that any modifications to her property had been properly approved by the HOA board, but I was ready for that too. The HOA board has no legal authority to approve modifications to community infrastructure, I continued, which is why the county is treating this as an environmental violation rather than a permit dispute. The engineering report should be available for public review within the next 2 weeks. By the time I sat down, Margaret's face had gone from confident to panicked to defeated. Half the room was staring at her with open hostility, and the other half was whispering furiously among themselves. The meeting ended 10 minutes later without any votes being taken on anything. The engineering report, when it was released, was even more damaging than I'd hoped. Not only did it confirm that Margaret's modifications had worsened the community flooding, but it also revealed that she'd used her HOA authority to waive normal review processes for her own construction project, a clear conflict of interest that violated both the HOA's bylaws and state regulations governing community associations. The county approved the eminent domain petition unanimously. Margaret's perfect backyard would be excavated to install proper drainage infrastructure at her personal expense, and she would remain liable for any future flooding damage related to her illegal modifications. But the real victory came in December during the HOA election. For the first time in 7 years, Margaret faced opposition, not just one challenger, but 4 different residents who'd been inspired by the drainage controversy to get involved in community governance. I wasn't one of the candidates. I'd done my research and learned that the most effective revenge isn't always the most visible. Instead, I worked behind the scenes, helping the other candidates understand the issues, providing them with documentation of Margaret's failures, and most importantly, making sure that every resident understood exactly how their HOA president had prioritized her own interests over community safety. Margaret lost in a landslide. She received less than 20% of the vote, finishing 4th out of 5 candidates. The woman who'd ruled Willowbrook Estates like her personal kingdom for 7 years was rejected so completely that she couldn't even maintain a graceful facade of dignity. The new HOA board's first action was to authorize an independent audit of all community infrastructure decisions made during Margaret's tenure. The second was to implement new conflict of interest policies that would prevent any future HOA official from using their position to benefit their own property at community expense. Margaret put her house on the market 2 weeks after the election results were announced. She couldn't live with the daily humiliation of being surrounded by neighbors who knew exactly how she'd abused her power, and she couldn't afford the ongoing liability for future flood damage. But the real satisfaction came on a Tuesday morning in early January, almost exactly 4 months after Hurricane Miranda had changed everything. I was on my dock at sunrise, fishing during whatever hours I damn well pleased, when I saw the moving trucks pull up to Margaret's house. I landed a beautiful base just as she came out to supervise the loading of her furniture. For a moment, our eyes met across the water. The grieving widower she'd tried to break, and the petty tyrant who'd chosen the wrong target for her cruelty. I held up the fish so she could see it clearly, then released it back into the water. She turned away without acknowledging me, but I could see the defeat in her posture. The woman who'd once threatened to drive me from my home was now fleeing in disgrace, while I remained exactly where I belonged. That afternoon, I got a call from the new HOA president asking if I'd be interested in chairing the community's new infrastructure planning committee. I accepted immediately. After all, someone needs to make sure our drainage systems work properly, and I happen to know exactly how to prevent the kind of flooding that can destroy people's homes and lives. The lesson here isn't that revenge is always the answer to petty tyranny. The lesson is that bullies like Margaret Thornfield count on their victims being too broken, too isolated, or too intimidated to fight back effectively. They use their power to make life miserable for people who are already struggling, secure in the belief that grief or fear will keep their targets compliant. But sometimes they pick the wrong target. Sometimes they attack someone who has nothing left to lose and everything they need to destroy their tormentor's carefully constructed world. Sometimes the quiet man with the fishing pole turns out to have access to information and resources that can reshape the entire power structure of their little kingdom. Margaret Thornfield thought she could drive a grieving widower away from the place where he'd been happy with his wife. Instead, she discovered that grief can be a powerful motivator when it's channeled into strategic thinking and patient planning. I still fish for my dock every morning and evening, usually during whatever hours I feel like casting a line. The new HOA board has more important things to worry about than regulating the recreational activities of residents who actually contribute to community safety and infrastructure planning. What would you have done if you'd been in my situation? Would you have tried to work within Margaret's system, or would you have fought back the way I did? Let me know in the comments, because I'm always interested in hearing how other people handle HOA tyrants and neighborhood bullies. And if you enjoyed this story of patience, planning, and perfectly executed revenge, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of people who fought back against petty authoritarians and won. Trust me, I've got plenty more stories about what happens when bullies pick the wrong targets.